Hello everyone. We're ready. We're going for a Halloween tour.
Think we'll see Casper the ghost?
Oh no, let's see.
Here we're here at the old town jail, just about to go onto a ghost walk.
And we're going to the graveyard.
At the old town jail, work our way through the town, go into the cemetery. It is the dead centre of town after all. Thank you. Nobody ever laughs at my jokes. And thank you very much, Beth. And along this tour, I'm going to be telling you some very grisly facts from history, some quite sad stories, and a few ghosts as well. We're going to start off with the old town jail. Another warning, I do have really bad dad jokes, so we're going to have to suffer through that. Sorry? So this here is our first stop. This is the old town jail. Now, the old town jail, it was built in the mid-1800s to replace the original prison at the toll booth, and I'll show you that later on. Now, the original prison at the toll booth was considered to be the worst prison in all of Great Britain during the 1700s and prior. Inside those prison cells, they would have had about 24 prisoners crammed into these tiny spaces like sardines in a can. They had minimal waste disposal services, so each morning these prisoners would step into yesterday's breakfast. It was just barbaric. Didn't meet up to health and safety at all. And so they built the old town jail to replace it. Now, when they built the old town jail, it was built under the Prison Reform Act. And this was supposed to be the new wave of the prison system. It was built to be one prisoner per cell, with lots of educational opportunities, lots of outdoor time. So when the prisoner was finally released, he could be a functioning member of society. It was quite the new wave, radical version of our prison systems. And then we were hit with budget cuts. And so what was supposed to be one prisoner per cell ended up being about 15 prisoners per cell. Now, that wasn't what made this place as horrible as it was. Now, the old town jail, the owner decided to hire a man called the staffman. And the staffman was the torturer, the executioner, the punisher, just all things quite grim. Some of his punishments would have included whipping, branding, and one called lugging, where they would go into the prison, pick out a prisoner of their liking, or maybe disliking, and bring them down the hill to the Market Cross, and I'll show you that in a bit. And they would have stretched the prisoner's earlobe out, placed it on this wooden post, and ram a nail through it, leaving the prisoner there to free himself. So once this prisoner ripped his own earlobe off, he wasn't actually freed. He was brought back up the hill to bleed out with his other cellmates. Now, a less gory version, but still quite psychologically tormenting torture method and punishment was right here. This is called the dark cell. So who would be brave enough to go in first? There we go. This was the isolation chamber. This was the isolation cell for the very naughty prisoners. It had an iron door blocking off all light except for coming from the roof. So have a wee peek. I promise I won't lock you in. The isolation chamber, the isolation cell, it was designed with a fireplace at the back because with the light source coming from that very small bush in the hole, it would have had water trickling in whenever it rained. It would get really cold in there. So the name, Jock the Happy Hangman, he was the most notorious, not because he was so brutal and evil and punishing, but because he was genuinely bad at his job. Now, Jock the Happy Hangman, he realised that if you don't mind hurting folk, the job of the staffman wasn't actually that bad. You see, you got your monthly wage, you got bonuses for each extra punishment you carried out, you got free accommodation, you got a daily meal, as much beer and water as you needed, and it was a job for life. They could not fire you. And so over time, Jock realised that he could just nip from work a wee bit early to go down to the pub and see all of his pals, and he started doing this more and more frequently, to the point where the owner of the prison said, "Jock, come on, the prisoners haven't been tortured in at least a month. The grounds are a mess, you have to do your job." So Jock said, you're right, but you know, I think my time's actually come. It's time for you to find me a wife. And if you don't find me a wife, I'm going on strike for 2 weeks. I'll just have a wee holiday. And that's what they did. They found Jock the Happy Hangman a wife. Her name was Tilly, and she was from Ireland, and she was a thief, and she was a streetwalker, meaning a bit of a prostitute. So it was a match made in heaven. They fell in love, got married, moved into their free accommodation, and on their wedding night, all of the children in Stirling decided to play a prank on him. So they went around and they gathered up as much horse manure as they could possibly carry, and they piled it up outside of his front door and his windows. And the poor souls got married in the winter time, so by the time they had woken up, they had to try and chisel their way out. Now, Jock the Happy Hangman did not meet a very happy ending in life. He became quite abusive to his wife Tilly, and Tilly ended up saying, "I've had enough. I'm not going to divorce you, but I'll make you a bowl of soup for your dinner." And she placed it on the table, and she placed a bone in the very centre of this bowl. So when Jock drank it, it lodged into his throat, and he choked to death. And after he collapsed, Tilly fled Stirling, never to be seen again, and got away with murder. Now, the Old Town Jail has not just seen murders and prisoners, but it was also a gas mask testing site during World War II. And inside one of the prison cells, you'll see how they've set it all up to test their equipment. And you'll also see the tunnel that these soldiers started to dig out because they had to quickly flee. And they got the tunnel all the way to that back wall and quickly realised that wall goes 15 feet deep. So they got stuck right at the exit. We'll keep heading up.
Here.
Now, along this tour, I'm going to tell you about 3 different ghosts. And the first one is rumoured to walk right along here. And that's the ghost of Jock the Happy Hangman. Now, the rumour is that every night at 6 o'clock, he wanders between these 2 gates here, because he's so angry about his death, so angry about his murder, or cold, we don't know which one. And yeah, so there's been a few sightings of him. Don't know how drunk people are when they see him, but he's always here at 6 o'clock at night. So by this time, I think he's probably at the pub.
Student accommodation.
Is it?
Now, during this tour, I don't just tell you about ghosts and murders and dramatic love affairs, but I also tell you about some of the more unsavoury or a bit strange characters of their time. And the first one that you'll meet is the character of Ebenezer Erskine. Now, Ebenezer was a minister, as was his father before him, but Ebenezer was kicked out of the Church of Scotland because he kept going off script and he was found to be a bit of a liability. So what do you do when your church kicks you out and now you're churchless? Well, you start your own religion, of course. And so he created the Erskine Family Church, right where that building is today. And it ended up becoming quite popular, ended up spreading around Scotland, but after his death, people stopped attending, started realising it's more of a cult than anything else. Now, unfortunately, the original building is not here, as it was burnt down. We believe that he created a few enemies, and so that was the reason that it was set alight. But Ebenezer is actually buried right here. This whole structure here is supposed to be his tombstone, and he designed it to look really grand, so that for centuries after his death, anyone walking by would think this man was incredibly important. And so up at the top, he's placed a pineapple to signify his wealth. But it's kind of backfired on him, because in certain places in America, if you leave a pineapple outside of your front door, it means that you're a swinger and you're looking for sex. So he had 10 children. With his second wife, he had 15 children, so he was a bit of a shagger. So I'm sure many of you know that this is Stirling Highland Hotel, which has a very nice spa and does quite good facials as well. I went there a couple of weeks ago. And originally this was a monastery that was later renovated and turned into Stirling High School. Now, when they were doing the renovations to turn it into the high school, they found a number of human remains underneath it. Many of those were charred bodies and quite a number of charred bones as well. Now, originally this area here had quite a massive city wall. As Stirling was a walled off city, kept their general population on this side, if there were any civilians that had come down with either the plague or later leprosy, they were to be banished to the outskirts and left there to die. If they happened to make a miraculous recovery, then they needed a clean bill of health signed off by a doctor, but that was incredibly challenging to do. There were a number of people inside the city that contracted illnesses and were slowly just decaying inside their own homes. When they were discovered, they were dragged out and placed into wooden huts just behind the city walls, and they were just left there to die. And over time, the bodies started to pile up. Ironically, where all of these bodies were is now the richest area in Stirling, Kings Park. Now, bringing it up to a bit more modern times, they are thinking about making a Stirling city bypass. And the area in which they were looking or hoping to build, they found a number of these mass graves over there. Now, they started to try and exhume people so that they could move them to a proper burial site. However, scientists came out and started to inform us that by lifting these bodies out, there's a high chance that they can bring back illnesses that has laid dormant for hundreds of years. So illnesses like the plague or severe cases of leprosy. So it has been put on hold for the now, but it will give Stirling a lot of money, so they'll probably just continue. Now, down over there, you'll find the Black Boys Fountain. And that is the site of a number of executions. We went through a couple of different phases of how we like to execute prisoners. We had the witch trials, which I'll tell you about later. They were particularly gory. We had our famous hangings down at the Black Boys Fountain. And prior to that, we had our favourite form, beheadings. Now, the Black Boys Fountain, that was chosen because the city wall had a number of holes in it, just through wear and tear, battles, the lot. And so when the executioner would go down there to execute the prisoner, after the death, after the hanging, if there was an angry mob wanting to chase him down, the hangman could duck and dive through the city wall holes, emerge back into society, take off his mask and blend back in so he wouldn't be chased. We're going to continue up the way. As we're walking up, please have a quick peek at the cannons. These were used in the Battle of Waterloo.
Alright, there you go. My regiment history. I never knew that.
Yeah, Waterloo.
Alright, so this is our next spot here. Now I might have to pause for a minute if they're coming down this way with the bagpipes, not sure. Are they going up that way?
Well, they're going in that building.
Oh, are they?
I think it's
Now, when I was telling you about the luggings, the executions, the hangings, they all happened right here at the Market Cross. Now, this was very strategically placed as that building right there, the toll booth, was the original prison. So these poor prisoners would look out from their cell windows, and not only would they watch the life that they're missing out on, but they would also witness their own fate happening before their very eyes. And just for a little bit of extra mental manipulation and humiliation, you see that blue door right there? That building belonged to Judge Norrie, judge at the time. Now, he used to come to his window every morning and taunt these poor prisoners. And at the very top, you can't see it unfortunately due to the spotlight, but they put a little carving of his face looking down on the street as a reminder for folk doing their daily shops, behave yourself, the judge is looking down on you. Also, when prisoners were led up the scaffolding here to be publicly executed, as they looked to the skies to plead to God, all that they were met with was the face of the man who had sentenced them to their demise. Now, once prisoners were executed, if they really wanted to send quite a grisly message and a reminder, what they would do is they would take the bodies down and either nail them or hang them to the sides of the toll booth right there and leave them there to rot. Now, those that were executed here, they were not all just prisoners that had committed heinous crimes or shoplifting. There were also a number of cases of those that were executed, and quite frankly, they shouldn't have been. Now, the first case is of Bird and Hardy. They were soldiers, they were actually commanders in the Radical War in 1820, and they were arrested and tried for treason because they were asking for the right to vote and they were asking for the right to decide their working hours as weavers. So once their militia group was infiltrated by government spies, they were arrested, tried and publicly executed right here. There was a crowd of about 2,000 people watching them, and as the two men were led up the scaffolding, their last words were, "Watch the blood spill across this Market Cross, and remember the words of Bird and Hardy." Now, after their deaths, they were left hanging here for 35 minutes, and after that, they were then beheaded. Their bodies were placed in caskets and taken into the prison cell, where they waited to bury them until 9 o'clock at night. Once they took them to the cemetery, their graves had to be guarded by soldiers, because that was quite ominous, because they knew that what they had done was unjust and that there were people waiting to unbury them, to dig them back up and take them to their rightful place of birth so that they could have a proper burial. Now, you might be thinking, it's all political prisoners, people that have committed crimes. If I was back then, I probably would have been fine. Well, you might have been, unless you were a woman. Not you. Acted a little bit different. They just didn't fit in the confines of society, then they would be accused. But don't worry, you get a fair trial. They would take you in, and if they thought, there's a high chance that you're a witch, but we have to test it, they had a foolproof method. They would unclothe you, they would take a needle, and they would prick your skin. They would prick you until they found a devil's mark. But this could be a freckle, a mole, a scar, a birthmark. And if they pricked this devil's mark and it didn't bleed and it didn't hurt, you were automatically a witch and you were to be executed. But what happens if they pricked it and it starts to bleed and the woman says, "Ow, that really hurts"? Well, there's always a backup plan. They would then take her to a body of water and take her right thumb and tie it to her left toe. Take her left thumb, tie it to her right toe, and throw her into the water. And if she sank to the bottom and drowned and died, she was a human and then exonerated. But if she held her breath, floated to the top and tried to survive, she was then automatically a witch and to be pulled out, untied, retied at a stake, and burnt alive. Now, this, as you can probably tell, is no longer a prison. It's now a cultural centre. But recently they found some more grisly facts about it. We'll move up a little bit. Fortunately, when Monday came, they forgot about him until 200 years later when they accidentally stumbled upon him while doing renovations. Now, this building here is our next stop. This is the Mars Wark. Now, this is considered to be cursed, and it's considered to be the second most haunted building in Stirling. Now, when the Earl of Mar was building it, he wanted it to be right outside of the castle, as he was the keeper of Stirling Castle. So when this building was set up, it was supposed to be so he could have a wee lie-in the mornings and still get up to work on time. But he was incredibly cheap, and so he decided that he was going to steal all of the materials for this building from Cambeth Kenneth Abbey. And so once this was once this was discovered, a curse was placed on him and a curse was placed on this building. Now, I honestly don't really believe in curses, but once I heard the story, I thought there might be something there. You see, the Earl of Mar, he died before they finished building his house, and so his widow moved in. His widow lived on the top floor section, and all of these wooden doors at the bottom, they all became shops. But they were like the Gucci's and the Pradas of the time. They would have sold French perfumes, really luxurious items. But his widow ended up dying inside of this house. On any given day, workers in these shops were known to become extremely ill or to simply drop dead in the middle of their shifts due to poor working conditions. Now, that might just seem like a bit of a coincidence. You know, back in the 1500s, all working conditions were rubbish. But later on, this building was shot at, it was set fire to, and you'll notice that there isn't a roof on it anymore. And that's because our idiot Bonnie Prince Charlie was mucking about up at the castle, loaded up a cannon, got his aim completely wrong, and accidentally blew the roof off his townhouse. Now we'll go have a closer look. I'll show you some details.
Golly.
So after this was a town and a townhouse and shops, it later became a French courthouse. And so if you see that statue right there, that statue is supposed to be Joan of Arc of France being burnt at the stake at age 14 years old. They felt so much compassion for her that they wanted to memorialise her on the side of this French courthouse. Oh, you've got a much better torch than me. Great. Now, along the sides, you might have noticed these little things sticking out. Now, these are all saints, but during the Reformation, I should say, these ones here were beheaded, and we don't really know where the stone has gone.
Seeing the times.
And one little piece that many people miss out on is this face right here. Now, this is a pagan spirit. It's called the Green Man. And because it was a spirit, and specifically because it was a pagan spirit, many people were quite terrified of it. They thought that, death and destruction would follow just because they put this face up here. But the Green Man is actually quite kind. The pagan spirit represents birth, life, death, and rebirth. Now, his face is on a lot of the headstones throughout the cemetery, but because it's paganism, he never faces the church. He's always on the back of these headstones. So, right, so this is our next stop. This is John Cowan's hospital. Now, many people think that John Cowan was this really good guy because after his death it was discovered in his will that all of his society was in Stirling. And so, shortly after his death, his brother signed the deed for this building and turned it into Stirling's hospital. And it became quite a staple in the community, for the rich and wealthy of course. And after it was a hospital, it became a lawyer's library and a lawyer's school. Then it became army barracks, and then it turned into what it is today, a Deans of the Merchants Guild's meeting hall. It's a bit of a mouthful to say. So with all of this, many people think, he must have been a really kind and generous man. But the fact of the matter is, when John Cowan was alive, he was not a good man. John Cowan was a bachelor all of his life, always lived with his sister. Nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that he was fined 3 times by the church for fathering illegitimate children with underage women. On top of that, when he was in his mid-20s, he disappeared for about 5 years. No one had any clue where he went off to, but when he came back loaded. Turns out he was a privateer, and all of the money and all of the different forms of wealth, gold, jewels, gems, he was supposed to turn back into the government and get his wage. Cheeky bugger decided, no, I'm going to pocket half of it and still get my wage from the government. And so when he got back to Stirling, he had this really cocky and entitled attitude about him. He thought he was untouchable. And so what he did was he bought a building at the top of the hill. And when move-in day came, he was looking around and he saw that this building had a beautiful bell tower. And when he looked up, he realised it doesn't actually come with a bell. So what do? Well, that night, John Cowan and his cronies decided to break into the toll booth, climb up the tower, nick the bell, drag it up the hill and place it in his own bell tower, which sounds like a euphemism, but I assure you it's not. And he was only caught when they went to go ring it, and it starts ringing up at the top of the hill. Now, there is a wee legend that on Scots-Pinay at midnight, John Cowan jumps down from his ledge, and he does a little dance, and he climbs back up there for the rest of the year. And I think he does the robot. But you have to party pretty hard to see that happen. Now, this here is the original side of the cemetery. It's divided into 2 parts. Our first part that we'll explore, this was all built in the 1100s when the church was first built. Now, the church was later burnt down in 1405 and then rebuilt in 1415. Unfortunately though, you won't find any headstones in this side of the cemetery up until about the early 1500s. The reason for that, this is a great example right here. Up until the early 1500s, folk that had lost a family member, they would come to the cemetery and they would look for a plot to bury their loved ones in. And they came up to this one here and thought, this is great, you don't have to walk too far, you get a great view, but there's already somebody buried here. They would just say, oh well, and pull out the original headstone, throw it away, and bury their family member on top of the person originally buried here. So over time, you can figure out which sites were the most popular as the ground has literally started to rise. Now, as this is the original side of the cemetery, you'll find a lot more damage here as well. If you move up this way a little bit. Over here on the side of the church, you'll find all of these bullet holes. These are all musket shots from the castle siege of 1657. Rebel forces used to come here and take the church as a point of refuge. And through the shattered out windows and the slits in the side, they would place their musket barrels and aim them at the castle, trying to fire that way. But with muskets you don't get a great aim and you don't get a very great distance. And so in the crossfire, a lot of these headstones became riddled with bullet holes alongside the side of the church. Now, I've got a few favourite graves that I want to show you, but I do want to mention that this is still an active graveyard, and it's quite a popular one at that. We believe to be a family plot, first because of the size of it, but more importantly because of these angels that are along the sides. Now, a lot of these headstones you'll find the same name written over and over and over again. As children were one of the highest mortality rates for years, parents would keep giving them the same name until one of them lived long enough to hold on to it, and then they would change up the pattern. So these angels, they are to represent the children buried here. Now, throughout the graveyard, you'll also find a number of skulls and crossbones. That symbolises a belief. Now, it was believed for years, up until about the 1500s, that when you die, the only way to get into heaven, the afterlife, wherever it is that you're going, was to have your skull and your two thigh bones buried in the same place. And finally, just over here, you'll find an hourglass. As they became so pragmatic and desensitized to the deaths around them, they would place this hourglass as a symbol that as soon as you're born, your time is running out, so live life to the fullest. Unfortunately, we don't know the dates of this grave, as it is so eroded away in the centre. All right, so this here is my second favourite headstone in the cemetery. Sounds a bit morbid to say, but this is the service stone. This was erected by John Service in memory of his father, and he poured so much time and money and dedication into meticulously picking out what kind of stone he wanted, what artwork he wanted, what inscriptions he wanted, that for years this was considered to be the most elaborate headstone in the entire cemetery. But you'll find here all of these bullet holes that came from that same battle that dented the side of the church. On this side, these bullet holes came from the rebel forces, and on the back you'll find bullet holes that came from the castle. Now, this one, and this one, they're actually supposed to be three separate headstones, and that's part of the reason as to why it's one of my favourites. Because if you look just down here, that little symbol there is supposed to be an arm on the side. And coming round here, you'll find a little pair of feet at the base. And round here you'll find another arm, and up at the very top you'll find the skull. Now, I've done a lot of reading about this. Many people say that it's a motif to the Bible, but from everything that I've read, it seems as though somebody was just having a bit of a laugh, and they thought it would be funny to be buried alive in stone. So feel free to have a wee look. You've got your torch on you, it makes it easier to see.
What's your... What's your move?
Now, my favourite headstone in this entire cemetery is just this one right here. This here is the grave of Mary Stevenson. Now, when Mary Stevenson died in 1823, her family came and they had her funeral right here, and they stayed for about 2 days. But by the second night, it was starting to get really dark. It was starting to become colder and colder, and it was starting to rain. And so they all said, right, let's pack up and let's go home. And as soon as the last family member left, a man came crawling out of the shadows with a shovel in his hand, and he dug her grave back up, and he stole Mary Stevenson's body. You see, as medicine was starting to take off, you could get a cheap buck for a freshly buried body, and it was completely legal as well. It was very popular to do at the time. But this particular grave robber was quite rubbish at his job. And so her family figured out where he was going and managed to intercept him, take her body back, and thankfully they reburied her. Unfortunately though, there were 2 funerals that day, and when they went to go rebury her, they accidentally put her in the wrong plot. So her headstone is nearer the church. They accidentally placed her here, so to remember where they put her, they carved the story of Mary Stevenson being ripped out by the stake by the grave robber, his bag, his shovel, and originally he would have had horns as well, just to symbolise how horrendous this act was. And when they carved it all in, they would have painted it by hand, and it would have been colourful and it would have been gruesome. Later on, one of her family members did move in next door. We'll keep heading up. Now, I said at the beginning that there would be parts of this tour that just became quite sad, and this is one of them here. This is the statue of Margaret and Agnes Wilson with their angel behind them. Now, Margaret and Agnes, they were 18 and 13-year-old sisters, and they were Presbyterians, and they were arrested alongside their entire family and their elderly neighbour and charged with treason because they refused to renounce their faith. And so when their court date came, the judge went through their family one by one, asking their parents first, renounce your faith and I'll set you free, or refuse and suffer the consequences. And so their parents said, we renounce. Their siblings said, we renounce. Their elderly neighbour renounced. But when it got time for these 2 girls, again 18 and 13 years old, they looked at the judge in the eyes and they said, no, we would rather die than lie about what we believe in. And so the judge said, so be it. And the way in which they were ordered to die is to be tied to stakes and placed into the river, the Solway Firth, and left for the tide to come in. Mm-hmm. As they were stood there waiting to die, there was an executioner stood next to them, watching them for hours on end to ensure that they would not break free. And for these hours on end, he kept asking them, he kept saying, come on, you're so young, just say the words, it's all right, God will not be mad at you, just say it. And the entire time that these 2 girls were waiting to die, they refused to say a single word. Eventually, as the tide rose, their throats were slit as an act of mercy. After their deaths, their family fled the UK, and many years later their father came back to do a tour. And he went from the north of Scotland all the way down to the south of England, and every time he stopped somewhere, he tried to leave something behind to remember his daughters by, whether that be a statue, a rock, a plaque, anything, just so the memory of his daughters would never vanish. However, it was the Victorians that erected this statue here for educational purposes. Their theory was that if we forget our history, then we are doomed to repeat ourselves, so we must never forget. But as we all know, history has still repeated itself to this day. On a lighter note, I did a practice tour with my Auntie Claire, and my Auntie Claire says that when she dies, she wants a statue like this of herself, but she also wants a fountain at the front that spouts wine and one that does chocolate as well, so we have to save up for that. Okay, so before I tell you a little bit about a ghost, I just want to briefly mention this statue here. The statue, God, what has happened to his eye? That's a bit scary. That's the statue of John Knox, the leader of the Reformation. Now, after his statue was erected, someone has come along and chopped his hands off as a way of saying, up yours, now you cannot preach with your fist and your finger in the air. When they erected his statue, underneath they placed a marble water fountain, and in the very centre of it you'll find the only bit of Hebrew in this entire cemetery, or as far as I've seen. And that Hebrew word means God. We think that John Knox was obsessed with the most original and purest form of the Bible, which would have been the Torah. and that's why they placed the Hebrew right there. Now, if you look behind you, you'll find the Ladies' Rock, or the Ladies' Viewpoint. Victorian women used to sit up there and watch over the graveyard as everyone came here in their free time for a little picnic, a little stroll, or simply just to hang out. But there is a side to it that many people have claimed to see, and that's the ghost of the Pink Lady. Now, the Pink Lady is considered, the thought is that she was the sole survivor of the castle siege in 1304, and when she returned back to the castle, she found her husband brutally murdered and left lying on the castle entranceway. And so, whenever people see her ghost, she is never entering the castle, she is always leaving, and her screams and her sobs can be heard echoing as she makes her way down the stairs and up to the Ladies' Rock, where she sits and looks over the castle, waiting for her husband to return to her. Now, if you look behind you over here, I'm making you turn a lot on this tour, you'll find the Star Pyramid. Now, that was constructed in the 1860s. I get my numbers back to front. Now, when they built that, that was there as a symbol for all that had died in the name of civil and religious liberties. And inside, when they were constructing it, they unsealed a Bible and a bit of scripture, and nobody's been able to get into it ever since. So there are a few theories about what's actually inside. Many people think that there's a mummy buried in there, and they wouldn't be too far off. We used to have a lot of mummies in Stirling. We used to have a lot in Scotland, actually, but we don't have any mummies anymore, and that's because the Victorians ate them all. The Victorians thought that eating mummified human remains would give them eternal life and really clear skin, and so they ate our way through our mummy collection. Okay, moving on. This one here might be one of my favourites. So the person that was buried here unfortunately died in a railway collision, but when they were burying him, they decided to add this little feature right here. Now, it's not a rock, that's part of the railway sleeper lines that he died on, going right the way under his grave, so he never forgets how he died. Normally you get a great view of the Wallace Monument, and there's one story in particular that I find to be quite gory about William Wallace. Now, he was he was over 6 feet tall with jet black hair and piercing blue eyes. The legend is that he had a birthmark in the shape of a bull that went from his neck onto his chest and turned bright purple whenever he got very angry. Now, his sword was about 5 feet long, and he used it like a kitchen knife. The story is that in mid-battle, he found an English soldier that had been stabbed in the leg, was crawling away back to safety. Now, William Wallace, he had already had his fair share of slaughterings during this battle, but he decided, I really need one more. So as this poor man was crawling away on his belly, trying to save himself, William slowly walked up to him, grabbed him by the foot, dragged him back, and skinned the man alive. Using the man's skin, he then proceeded to make himself a braided belt to hold his dagger. Over there, on those stairs, get my torch on, many people have said that they've seen a ghost. Now, this is the final ghost of the evening as I bring the tour to an end. I mentioned before that there was a Pink Lady up at the rock. Now, she's a nice ghost. She's heartbroken and devastated over the loss of her husband, but overall she's friendly. She won't harm you. The ghost that's seen here, though, is the ghost of the Green Lady. Now, the Green Lady was a servant to Mary Queen of Scots, and she was very superstitious as well. She thought that on the 13th of September, the castle would be engulfed in flames and would take the life of Mary. And so, when the date of the 13th came round, the Green Lady decided that she was going to stay awake all night just to protect Mary And she sat in the bedchambers, staying awake, making sure there was no fire. And as the night went on, she grew more and more weary, felt her eyelids start to droop. She began to nod off to sleep. And just as she fell asleep, her arm went forward, knocked over a candle, caught the curtains on fire, and the whole castle went up in flames. Now, she very quickly woke up, realised the error that she had made, and rushed Mary to safety. And as Mary got out of the door, the whole building just caught alight, and it trapped the Green Lady inside. So, what people claim is that whenever something bad will happen in the castle, or if something bad is going to happen specifically to you, you will see the Green Lady floating down that staircase right there. Now, that is the Dark Side tour. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Before I let you go, could I ask you for a favour? If you could line up against the wall, that sounds a bit scary. I would just like to take your photo.
So that's us for tonight, guys. I hope you enjoy it. And please don't forget to subscribe and smash the like button. Cheers!